Hello class, today we're going to be talking about freehand sketching. I thought it would be a good idea to do freehand sketching earlier in the syllabus. That gives you an opportunity to get hold of all your drawing equipment before we really get into the geometric construction next week. So today is all going to be about freehand sketching, and for that we don't need this drawing board, so let's put that out of the way. So in your textbook, if we have a look on page 72, you can see we've got a short section called Freehand Sketching, and it's got some examples and some exercises. So what I'm going to be doing today is showing you some freehand sketching techniques and explaining to you why it's important. And then I'll do two examples for you as well. So why do we have to learn freehand sketching? When there's lots of different ways of doing engineering drawings. I'm teaching you how to do drawings with drawing equipment, with drawing boards, with protractors and compasses. So that allows you to do a really accurate scale drawing, which is very useful because it gives you a nice sense of proportion. The other way to do engineering drawing is on a computer, where we learn a CAD software, computer-aided design software. And this allows us to generate three-dimensional models and then create engineering drawings from that. So it's a very powerful tool, and we'll get to that later in the syllabus. But if we look at freehand sketching, it's still a very useful tool because very often we don't have a computer available. Very often we don't have our drawing equipment with us. But sometimes we're walking somewhere, maybe in a factory, it may be talking to a friend over coffee, and suddenly we come up with an idea and we think, oh, that would be a great way to solve a particular problem. And then we want to record this idea, and we want to develop the idea, and we want to create a picture. So that's where freehand sketching comes in. So it can be very useful. It's a useful communication tool as well, because you can show someone by drawing them a picture in a much clearer way than you can just by explaining things with words. So that's basically the reason why we need to know how to do freehand sketching. And for this section of work, all we're going to need is our pencil and a rubber, so we can erase again. So when it comes to freehand sketching, the same rules apply when it comes to the line styles. So for example, we will have a continuous line, we will have a construction line, a center line, maybe a hidden line, or even a chain dotted line. So we just have to learn to draw them a little bit more neatly. So the same rules apply. In fact, the same rules of orthographic projection, isometric projection, even dimensioning and sectioning, that all applies to freehand sketch drawings. The only difference is we're trying to draw it as neatly as we can, just with our hand and our pencil, not using any equipment. Right, so this is a skill that you really need to practice, and is going to be very useful in the future. So when we do freehand sketches, there's basically a simple procedure that we follow. What we do is we start with a proportion of something. And we start on the outside and we draw boxes to represent the proportion. And then we slowly work our way inwards, adding more and more detail to the drawing until we have the final drawing. And we go around all the edges and we darken them to complete it. All right, so let's start off with this exercise. So this is on page 72 in your textbook. I'm just going to move that to the side so that you can see that while I'm sketching. So how would I approach drawing this isometric block on my page? Let me just give myself some additional room. So remember, we're not trying to measure anything, but proportion is the most important thing. So if we're going to draw an isometric drawing, All isometric drawings start with an axis system. So there's a vertical axis, so we'll draw a vertical line. And then we've got two 30-degree axes. So this angle would actually be 30 degrees. And we've got another 30-degree axis going that way. So you can see I'm drawing as neatly as I can, but very lightly. I'm sketching the axes. Now if I have a look at this block, I can see that it is much longer in this direction than in that direction. And to my eye, it also looks more or less the same height as it is in width. In fact, if you had to take this height or this width, it looks almost as though the block is double the length than it is the width and the height. So that's a useful thing to keep in mind. All right, so let's just estimate. I'm going to go for around about here and say, okay, that is the width of the block that I'm going to be drawing. If I'm going to make it the same height, remember in isometric, all your axes in one plane are in line. The vertical ones all go that way, and then these ones will go in that direction. So I'm going to draw a line in this direction to indicate the top of that block. So that's my construction line. So these ones we're going to go over later, darker, when we finish all the detail. Right, so that's more or less a block, but as you can see, it's drawn in isometric. So now we have a point here that we can take in that direction, because all of these axes are parallel for isometric. So if we take that distance, that would be more or less here. But now we want to double that distance, so that would take us to around about there. So let's extend this axis. Now that we've estimated that point, then we need to draw the vertical axis. Remember, I'm starting off just by drawing the bounding box, as we call it, the outside. So now this line is parallel to that one. I'm going slightly off my page, but maybe I can just make it. All right, so the back would go in this direction. And I can just neaten it up a little bit so I don't get confused later. So there you can see I've created a box that represents the proportion of the outside of this component. So now if I start adding detail, I know that basically the box is going to be in proportion. Let's start on the left hand side and the front, or the end of the block. You can see we've got kind of an L shape here. So let's just estimate it's going to be around about there. So we'll sketch that down, and it looks a little bit thicker at the bottom than that vertical part. So we'll sketch that, and then that will carry on around on this face, which we could call the front. That looks halfway to me. So here's our halfway mark. So that vertical little step, remember these lines are all parallel. Keep them parallel so that your proportion stays correct. All right, so we've got a step going up. All right, now at the back we've got a notch that's cut out, so that would go in this direction. In fact, all of these would have lines like that. This one is already there. So that would have a vertical line there, and then that line is this horizontal one, and at that point we come straight down and then straight forward again. So I can kind of get rid of some of my construction lines that are getting in the way. And if you draw them nice and lightly, then it's easy to differentiate. Alright, so that is the front face. I'll get back to the hole a little bit later. Alright, so now we know we've got this point where this angular surface starts. It ends at the top surface. In fact, we can draw this one on so long. It seems to go back a little bit further than halfway. So halfway would be there, so that goes on a little. So let's estimate that it's going to go to around about there. And let's take a line across. Now remember, this line is a construction line for the edge of the block, but in fact our top surface now moves across from that corner. So this one is not actually part of our drawing. Alright. So now we know that that line comes from there to here. So that's easy. We just draw a straight line. Sketch it from here to there, and if we're lucky we can draw another parallel line from this side to that side, and we'll have that slanting surface. Now, well, this looks a little bit shorter to my eye than that one, but that's good enough for now. It's a freehand sketch. Alright, now we get to the tricky part, which is the circles. Now whenever you're drawing an isometric drawing, and freehand sketches are very often done as isometric drawings or as three-dimensional type of drawings, because typically you're drawing it as you see it in front of you. If it's a machine or some part, it's lying on the table or it's standing in the workshop, and you're drawing it as you see it, and you'll always see it in 3 dimensions. You won't just see it as an orthographic view, although you can do freehand sketches of orthographic. Alright, so now for an isometric drawing, what we've done, let me just do a quick illustration here for you. If we had to draw a circle freehand, one way to do it is to create a box, which is a square. We can draw the center, find the center of that square, and then we can kind of create arcs around, so that we know, we can get more or less in proportion what the circle looks like. What you can see has happened here in an isometric drawing is we've lifted this axis up by 30 degrees. So if we redraw this circle, but we make that axis 30 degrees. So we take that box and then we deform it so that the horizontal axis is now at 30 degrees, and we redraw our center lines. Now if we draw the same circle, we're still going to join those axes, but you'll see that these two radii are quite big, whereas this one is quite sharp. It's a much smaller radius. In fact, it's an ellipse that we've just drawn here. But we can see it as a small radius and a large radius, if you want to understand it that way. So that shows you what an isometric circle would do on a vertical face. On a horizontal face, the axes are twisted in a different direction. So I'm going to reproduce that on my drawing. I'm going to find the center of this face, because that looks like it's central to me. It also looks like it's central in height. So there's my center point of my hole, which is an ellipse. Now I've got to estimate the size of it. So let's just draw a box. Once again, it's like a bounding box. That looks a little bit off on this side. So that's more or less what my box would look like. I can then create the large radii and then the small radii of my circle. So that's a bit of a mess there. And another one here. So there's my circle, and you'll see it's actually got a center line going through that direction. Alright, one thing you notice which is difficult in freehand sketching is drawing reverse curves. The reason for that is when you're moving your hand, your wrist is your focal point. That's the pivot point. So it's much easier to draw a curve in that direction. So because it's a natural movement for the wrist. So if you try and draw a curve in this direction, you've got to use the fine motor skills of your fingers. So it's much harder to draw a curve in that direction than this direction. So when you're freehand sketching, I would always suggest that you turn your page around so that you can draw this curve, because you're going to get a much smoother transition, because that's a natural motion of your hand. Alright, so let's finish off this box. How do we do that? We have to just go around and make everything darker. And we can maybe correct some of our proportion as we see it. Okay, let's draw the outline. And freehand sketching is actually easier with a slightly softer pencil. I'm using HB, and this is a 0.7. So you can see how the drawing starts to pop out above the construction lines. Sometimes you have to get up and move around a bit. This line goes all the way across. Draw some vertical lines. This back one is actually a little bit off. And that corner is not meeting up. Alright, so there's your isometric freehand sketch. Now the nice thing is you can add dimensions. Now remember, if you're going to do isometric dimensions, you need to keep your leader lines in line with the axes. So I could put a dimension like this. Remember to do them nice and thin. And do an isometric arrowhead, which looks like it's flat. So we're not given dimensions, but we could just put something in there. Let's call it 50 millimeters. Yeah, that's not in line with the axis. So that would go more there. Do a dimension like this. See, I make the base of my arrow at an angle, which is then in line with one of the axes, so it looks like it's flat. So So let's call that 100 millimeters because we thought it looked like it was double. We could give a height. Call that 50. We could add other dimensions too. Remember, we've got to keep them in line with our axes. So that's 50. Then this would look like 30 to me. All right, so that's not all the dimensions. Let's just put a diameter on this one, because that looks like quite an important component. We can put an extension line, and we can call that diameter 20 because it's a little bit less than the height. I'm just guessing these dimensions, but just to show you how we would put dimensions on things. When it comes to circles, we also have to remember to do some center lines. So we could do one in this direction as well. We don't have to, but we can just take out some of the construction lines without rubbing too much out, just to make the drawing pop out a little bit better. All right, so there's a freehand sketch. Now, for the exercises that you're going to do, or let me say the project, which I've uploaded on the Moodle site, you're going to have to do a freehand sketch of your project as your first submission, and included in that you need dimensions, and you also need labels. So a label, you could do something like this. You can have an arrow, and then you could just say block. You're going to be drawing an assembly, so you would have separate components. This is a single component. So I don't have more than one part here, but I can put some labels on it. Oh, okay, it's a little bit skewed, but you get the idea. So the idea for a freehand sketch, the reason it's so useful is you can be, and in some remote location, you can do quite a detailed engineering type drawing, and you can even record proportion, dimensions, and details and tolerances on this drawing, and you can take it back to the office, and then you can do your CAD drawing after that. So a very useful skill to have. But the important thing is, don't just focus on the drawing itself. You need to think about recording information like dimensions, because then that can be transferred to a scale or a CAD drawing at a later stage. So the whole idea is you're capturing information on this freehand sketch. All right. There's one more freehand sketch example that I want to do for you, and that is a freehand sketch that's in the presentation files. So let me just show you the procedure. I will slowly draw it. So it's some kind of a bracket. I will start drawing it here. This would be an orthographic projection, so this is not an isometric drawing. It has a base that looks like it's about that thick, so proportionally, let's draw that. And I think the base would come out a little bit further and end about there. Right, so we start with our bounding box. Then we start adding some construction detail. This is a component that's coming out the side here. So we'll draw that. got kind of a boss thing here that we have to construct. Then the base of it actually comes back at a bit of an angle, or a curve actually, and then sort of curves back, and it gets fatter towards the bottom. Actually goes past that point. I think it curves a little bit back again. So and it goes up and around. So this is actually a curve. So you can see I'm struggling to do a reverse curve sketch here. Alright, this is actually a circle. So let's construct our circle. It's got a hole in the center. And then that part tapers up, and there's a smooth transition here. In fact, the base has a bevel along it, and a bit of a step in the middle, like that. Alright, so that curves up and goes around. On this side we have another boss, and then that has a hole going through it. And there's actually a web or a rib along the center, and then along this edge. So that kind of blends in, and then it's double line through to there. Blends in round to there. Alright, I think that's all the details. So now I can just go around and make this whole thing a little bit neater and darker. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but we want a sense of proportion so we can see what it's going to look like. This is actually a dotted line. Okay, let's do this outside. And this one. And we curve it in. All right, straight lines are quite tricky. But not impossible. Okay, a few more details here and there. some center lines. Center points. And I think that's about it. All right. In the presentation sketch, I think this is a little bit thinner and that's a little bit taller. But it's a freehand sketch. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but we want to try and get our proportion as good as possible. All right, so that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoy practicing your freehand sketches. Just remember, it's a really good skill to have. And it's very impressive if you can sketch out something when your boss is telling you an idea and he can see you create a drawing like this. You'll create a really good impression. Okay, till the next time.